Let's dive into this problem. Next slide. This is how it starts, okay? There's two sources of mycotoxins and molds. One is it grows on food. It grows on crops all over the world. And that I'll show you in a little bit. The other is anything with water intrusion. When water comes in behind the washer and dryer, the hookup for the ice machine, there's all the flashing around the window, the chimney up on the roof, all kinds of places where water gets in the home. Now, the problem begins if mainly because of construction. In this country, almost anybody can go to the government, local government, get a permit and start building a house after he's gotten the right permits. And I'll give you an example. My brother is an architect in Switzerland. In Switzerland, an architect has to be licensed by the country, by the federal government, and he has to sign off on any construction, a barn, and say that that place will be standing 100 years from now. Here, we put up a house in 6 months, quickly. And what courses did those people actually take to learn what they're doing? Now, electricians, yes, and plumbers, yes, but all the others. And then in some of the states, there's actually people from other countries who've emigrated here. And they don't know what a shower pan is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And let me give you first a little background. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon. My dad was an American in the oil business. And he was Dartmouth and Princeton graduate. And then when I was 10, and my mother's Swiss. She's going to be 101 in 10 days. And she still lives by herself, cooks, cleans, does everything, and tells me and my two other brothers what to do, how to do it, and report back. And she can thread a needle without glasses. Imagine. Anyway, strong lady. So, and then I was sent to boarding school in Switzerland, and I was lucky. I skipped grades and I graduated when I was 14. I was going to go to school where my dad went, and I got into Dartmouth, but they said you can't live in the dorm till you're 16. So then I went to, in New England, I went to a prep school up there, Vermont Academy, for a couple of years just to grow a little older. So anyway, so in Switzerland, and in a lot of countries, if you go to Italy, if you go to Holland, which is surrounded by canals, you'll see dates on the homes from the 1500s and 1600s. Can you imagine one of these houses that I passed by on the way here being here in another 400 years? No, not going to happen. So, this is part of the problem. These things that happen. Next slide. So all the government, you know, the people in these agencies agree that within 24 to 48 hours of mold, of water intrusion, you're going to have mold grow. Imagine a seed, a packet of seeds that you buy at the store, and you take those seeds, they're dormant, they're not doing anything. You can pour them in a plate. They're not going to do anything until you plant them in soil and water them. Then it's going to sprout and give you a plant, a flower, or whatever it is you bought. Same here. Molds are in this room. They're everywhere. Mold spores. Okay, they're everywhere. But they don't do anything. They're dead. Not dead. They're dormant. And then once they get wet, after 24 to 48 hours, they start to sporulate and release spores. And they go everywhere. You step across a carpet, poof, poof, You can't see them, but that's how basically it happens. Next slide. Okay. When it's wet, it's going to have mold growth, and mold spores do something. We're just talking about mold now. They produce inflammation in the body. So when you breathe them in, it's going to cause inflammation in your sinuses, in your trachea, and in your lungs and your bronchioles. Okay? So you're going to have problems with the respiratory tract because of this. Next. All right. It's an equal opportunity pollutant. I was involved, I saw a lady and her son and her husband, and they were from Dripping Springs, Texas. And, oh, there's Shoot 'em Up, Texas, too. It's a real town. So anyway, in Dripping Springs, Texas, and she was a wealthy lady. She was actually a banker from New York. She built a small structure, 15,000 square feet, and had it custom built, and after it rained, it leaked. And her son and her husband and she got sick, and they sued the insurance company, Farmers. And I had to testify as to what her condition was and what more than likely than not caused it, because there was no other explanation. And she won, this is back 20 years ago, she won $23 million. No ability to appeal. And the next day, in the Austin Statesman, which is the newspaper for the capital of Texas, there was an article about how this Dr. Andrew Campbell in Houston cost Farmers Insurance $23 million. That put a big target on my back. So anyway, next slide. Dr. Dor Dearborn, good friend of mine at the Cleveland Clinic, is a pediatric pulmonary specialist. And there was this really bad flooding in an area of town where, and face it, there's a lot of landlords who don't repair things the way they should. They paint over it, they cover it up with chlorine or Clorox or something like that. They don't take care of the problem. And what happened 3 months later is all these kids were arriving limp in the emergency room, blue. Why? Because they were hemorrhaging, they were bleeding from their lungs. Pulmonary hemorrhage. And so this was very worrisome because there were 37 kids, and what happened is it was due to this mold, Stachybotrys, that was on the walls. Cellulose is another word for gypsum or drywall. And the 12 children died. And 60%, when they went back to their house, had more bleeding in their lung. Next. Okay. World Health Organization decided to name this, give it a name, and give it criteria. And I can tell you that in 1987, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study that said that probably about 500 million American workers are exposed to mold at work. We're going to get to that point in a little bit. Next slide. Children. Why? Because remember, children are shorter, right? So their nostrils and their mouth and their breathing is closer to that moldy carpet, moldy whatever, and can breathe in the spores. Plus, they have a higher metabolic rate. You know, they run. They don't stand still. The other part is they have an immature immune system. They're still forming their immune system, which is the defense mechanism of the body. The other is they don't have fully developed organs. The liver of an adult is about this big. In a child, it's this big. Think of the brain. Look at their head. Brain stops developing at around age 25. So their organs are not mature. And lastly, they don't have the methods yet to detoxify through the liver, the kidneys, etc. So that's why they're affected. So at any one time, 10 to 25 million workers, I said 500 million, I'm sorry, 10 to 25 and 800 to 1.2. This is 93. So I think now, 25 years later, it's much higher because more buildings, more everything. Next. Okay. We breathe about 700 cubic feet of air per day. So that air better be fresh and healthy and not have particles in it. Don't sit too long behind a diesel truck when the engine is running, etc., etc., etc. So the other part is 20% of the population has these lung conditions, okay? Why? Inflammation, okay? And in another recent study, almost 75,000 women were studied who were postmenopausal, and 3,600 had breast cancer due to poor air quality. Next slide. Okay, the other part. When you get a mold inspection, these CIH, Certified Industrial Hygienists, will come and they'll measure what's outside in front of your home, and then they'll go inside and measure what's in the home. I've sat on many panels with them, and I asked them a long time ago, I said, let me ask you, when you measure in front of that house and 15, 20 minutes later, a wind blows through, not a big wind, just a wind, does it change your, oh yeah. I said, what happens if it drizzles 20 minutes later? Does that change anything? Of course. What happens if it really rains bad? Yes, it'll change it all. I said, so why the hell do you do it? And they said, because we're taught to do it this way. But they charge you. That's the other part. One more thing. There's molds that are more common outside than inside. So that makes a big difference. The other part is the comparison of what's outside and inside has nothing to do with how you're affected by molds, spores. Any human activity. You open a window, the AC is off, now it's on. That'll change what comes out in those 15 minutes that person is there in the house. What happens if people walk through it, through a room? That changes. So there's so many things. So it's what I'm trying to tell you, it's very imprecise. It's not a good measure. Can you imagine if we did EKGs like they do this? My gosh. Next slide. Okay. This is the EPA. 50%, half of the mold growth is hidden. You can't see it. It's behind a wall. It's behind the washer and dryer. It's behind the refrigerator. How many of you have pulled out your fridge in the last year to check behind it? How many of you pulled out the washer or dryer in the last year to check what's behind it besides lost socks and things? Okay, you don't. Nobody does. So, it only reveals the testing reveals only what was done at that point in time. Doesn't tell you anything about what happens on a regular day. Lastly, anything, you can have it in ventilation ducts. You know where the heater and the air conditioning comes through? It could be hidden 3-4 feet away from, and you can't tell. And every time it comes on, you're breathing it. Another interesting source, I had patients who came to see me from Chicago. they had a Suburban. And you know the vents in front of the main window? Water had gotten in there because it rains, and mold grew in the blower. And every time they turned on the heat or the air conditioning in their Suburban, it affected them. It got so bad that General Motors had to change the design because it was happening to them and a lot of other people, and eventually they lost some money, and so that's when that prompted them to change the design. Otherwise they would have continued. All right, next slide. Why is this happening now? Why now? Why not 20, 30, or 50 years ago? Because we used to make walls with plaster. Plaster is alkaline, the opposite of acidic. Nothing grows on it, okay? But it's very intensive. It's labor intensive. It's not a quick thing. The other part later on is that we started putting in fans, ceiling fans. Grandma's place had a ceiling fan and a couple other fans, and she kept the windows open. Anything that blew in blew right back out. So, and then World War II ended. And what happened? All these young men came home, and all these young women were waiting for them. And then they got married, played hide the weenie, and had children. And when they had children, that's the baby boomers, okay? And those baby boomers, they needed homes. So that's when suburbia began. Homes built one after the other, one after the other. That's when it all started, and that's when construction started. They needed these homes quickly. They couldn't wait a year or two. They needed the homes now. They couldn't keep renting a small apartment because they were having kids and kids. So then in the 1970s came the world oil embargo against the United States. The Arab oil producing countries said, we're not going to give you any more oil because you helped Israel and they beat the pants off us. So we're not going to give you any more oil. What happened back then? Cars, you remember the cars back then? I love old cars, so I know. You know, they had fins. The back seat was like a living room couch. And they got 10 miles to the gallon, maybe. So now all of a sudden these little teeny, itty bitty teeny little cars started showing up that got 20, 25 miles a gallon, called Honda. And they were tiny. They looked like something that had fallen off a charm bracelet to people who had big cars. So that oil embargo triggered the following. Next slide. It was a fuel crisis, and so the government said, we've got to change the way we build buildings. We're going to build them tight. No air in, no air out, no windows. Think of tall buildings. The windows don't open. There's no way that you can open a window. And to get in, you have to go through 2 sets of doors. So the air that's warmed in the winter stays inside, and the air that's cooled in the summer stays inside, so you don't use as much the heating and ventilation and air conditioning system, which uses electricity, and you need oil for the electricity. So that was the thinking behind then. So we built tight buildings, and back then people smoked in buildings, and that air went right on circulating right through all the building. There was a huge problem with Southwest Airlines, their main reservation center in downtown San Antonio, because people on one floor smoked and people on the other floor didn't. So anyway, then we stuff it with all this chemical processing material called insulation. And then when you paint or lay a floor or do anything or put up wallpaper, anything, those release volatile organic compounds. They don't go out. You don't open the windows. They start going and circulating inside those buildings. Next slide. Okay, this is what we use. Drywall. If you drive by Home Depot, if you drive by, say, Lowe's, you'll see it in the back. They're stacked outside. And guess what happens when it rains? They get wet. And here's something. It's compressed gypsum between 2 layers of durable paper. Paper is cellulose. Remember the previous slide where I said cellulose? Okay? So it absorbs water and dries very slowly. But a builder will want, I don't know how many drywalls, and he'll go in there. He doesn't care if it rained that afternoon or the day before or whatever. He just picks them up and hauls them off. Okay? And then puts them up. And then the home's not finished yet, and it rains. It rains on this stuff. And then you put up walls, and this stuff is growing mold. Now you're getting the picture a little bit about construction and all that. And so it's a perfect recipe. And especially for this mold Stachybotrys, which is the one that caused all the problems in Cleveland 20 years ago. Next slide. So, let's talk about some of the health effect. High-fat diet will change the composition of the gut, okay? You actually want a high-fat diet. You want to eat a lot of meat, you want to eat a lot of vegetables, and a lot of legumes. Do you know the difference? No. Vegetables are what you're thinking of. Legumes are beans, lentils, things that you have to cook to make them soft. Okay? Those are all good for you. What is not, fruits are okay, but they have a lot of fructose, so be judicious. Like I've had patients come to me, and what they do is they juice 2 oranges, half a dozen strawberries, and I don't know what else. And I said, how do you think your digestion is going to handle? When was the last time you sat down and had all that raw, ate it and not juiced it? That's not a good idea, because that raises your fructose in your blood, and then you have a problem called diabetes. But anyway, and as little carbohydrates as you can, pasta, bread, all that, anything made with wheat, rice, soy, etc. Reduce that, and that'll help you with this. The other part is there's a mold called Cryptococcus, and it's the #1 cause of fungal meningitis. And doctors miss it all the time because they do a spinal tap and they ask for a bacterial culture, and nothing will grow out because it's not a bacteria. And mold takes 7 days to grow out. They'll throw that plate out after 24 hours and said, no growth. Of course there's no growth, because it's not bacteria. And they put it on a growth medium for bacteria, not for mold. You have to use a different one for mold. Doctors don't think of that. And I can tell you, I've seen many, many patients who are hospitalized at some of the finest hospitals that we have in Houston. It didn't matter. They missed it. The other part is it results about in 1.6 million deaths all over the world. It's most common where there's a lot of crops, like in what they call the Valley in Texas, the Valley in California, and the breadbasket, Iowa, Nebraska, and all these areas. So it's not unusual. Next slide. Okay. Here's what you can develop. Mycotic infections, mycosis, okay? This is fungus, again, mold. Fungal rhinosinusitis. This is the crud. This is where you've got this runny nose that's chronic. You go see the doctor, and he puts you on an antibiotic and a decongestant. And you feel better, and then a couple of weeks later it's back again, because what happens is with the inflammation, the more mucus you have. That's what you're blowing out on the Kleenex, mucus. And the more mucus you have, that allows bacteria to come in and grow on that mucus. So you take the antibiotic, that kills that layer of bacteria on top of the mucus. It never hits the tissues underneath, which is the sinuses, etc. So, IgE-mediated sensitivity. This is asthma. This is allergies, okay? And then hypersensitivity pneumonitis. It's a type of pneumonia that you get from mold, okay? And lastly, cytotoxicity. Cyto is the medical word for cells. It's toxic to cells. Next slide. Okay. There you go. Here's very important facts. Keep going till it, there you go. Thank you. They multiply, molds multiply very quickly, faster than rabbits, rats, or anything else that you can imagine. They just woof. And they release a substance called a mycotoxin. So here's a mold spore, and here's a mycotoxin on top of it. What is that? What is a mycotoxin? Again, it's a toxin, right? Mycotoxin. Myco means from mold, toxin. So let me tell you the story of how mycotoxins were discovered. They were actually discovered a long time ago, but I will tell you that, for example, a Scottish doctor by the name of Fleming, William Fleming, he was later became Sir William Fleming, but William Fleming was working in his laboratory and he left 2 dishes and forgot to cover them. And he put them on his, in his lab on a table, and then he went on a holiday. In Europe, they take holidays, we take vacations, okay? So he went on a holiday. And when he came back, the bacteria, which was Staphylococcus, you've heard of staph? That's a mean son of a gun, was dead. And the other dish, which had a mold called penicillium, had grown nicely. So he figured out something from penicillium killed this bacteria, and he developed from it the first antibacterial called penicillin, the first antibiotic, okay? What mycotoxins, so you know when you find that heel of bread in the back of your refrigerator wrapped in the plastic, and you look at it and it's got black fuzzies and green fuzzies and orange dots and all kinds of things on it, what that is mold and bacteria. The mold mycotoxin kills the bacteria, so that slice of bread goes only to the mold. I've been in buildings. A judge took me in a building once. It was a bank building and it had been shut for 5 years due to mold before it got to finally the litigation. And I thought this place would be full of cockroaches and ants and spiders and things like that. After 5 years, you know, they would have the run of the place. This is what you'd think. There was nothing, just the mold, because the mycotoxins killed everything else off. You starting to get the picture? Okay. One of the things it does, it's a very potent protein synthesis inhibitor. What does that mean? It means you can't make protein. And protein is necessary for the body every day. It doesn't mean you have to eat a 16-ounce steak every day. Far from it. But protein is what makes us work. It's what fuels the brain. It's what's all the body. What makes your muscles move in and out so you can breathe. What helps you digest food and keep the intestinal tract moving. All those things depend on protein. And if you don't have protein, you're going to get sick. And this is what mycotoxins do, among other things. Molds also produce this, which is a inflammatory material. The second word up there, lipopolysaccharides, are another inflammatory material. And the third one is solvents. Do you know what a solvent is? It's, ever hear of trichloroethylene? That's what they use in dry cleaning. Anything ending with ene, benzene, trichloroethylene, all these chemicals are solvents, and solvents are all toxic to the brain. They're neurotoxic to the brain and the nervous system. What does that mean? Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, multiple sclerosis, etc. That's what they attack. Tremors. I had a patient once, he was a radiologist. Now, most radiologists read x-rays. I mean, if you go get an x-ray, it's the technician who's going to tell you, hold your breath, okay, now breathe. Okay, it's not the radiologist. He's in the back somewhere reading x-rays and dictating his results, okay? This guy was an interventional radiologist. They're the highfalutin kind. What they do is they look at an organ system with their equipment, x-ray, ultrasound, MRI, and say that there's a particular spot that you want to aim at because you want to inject that spot with, say, I don't know, an anti-cancer drug or something, chemo drug or some sort of whatever. He is the guy who can actually take a long needle and get it right at that spot. That's an interventional radiologist. He was 42 years old when he flew over thousands of doctors to come see me, and he says, I can't work. I said, why? Well, how's he going to hold a needle? He can't. The other thing is, he came to see me because he had in his nightstand drawer a large bottle of Advil, and he finally noticed he didn't have any more. He needed to go out and buy another big bottle. And he said he was having headaches and other symptoms, and that's when he realized there was something wrong. Well, later on he found out what was wrong. What was wrong was he dictated his stuff, all his x-rays and his results and findings, etc., in a room. And one day, somebody came and knocked on the door and said, excuse me, I need to check this half door behind you because that's where all the liquids are kept to process the films for the x-rays. And the guy went back there and came right back out, and he says, I don't know what's happened, but there has been a spill and it's full of mold. And that's when the light went on in him. And he said, now I know what caused this. So, next slide. Okay. Here are two important points. Okay, one, if there's a mold in a place, indoor space, work, home, wherever, that produces a mold, the mycotoxin from that mold is going to be there as well. The other thing, one mold produces a whole bunch of different mycotoxins. One mold is not one mycotoxin. It produces a whole bunch of them. So you're not going to only have the mold, you're going to have a whole series of mycotoxins affecting your health. Next slide, please. Size matter. Hair. The width of a hair is approximately 100 microns. Mold spores are 1 to 20, about 10 microns. So 10 times the width of a hair. You can still see them under a microscope. You can't see them with just your eyes. A mycotoxin is 0.1 microns, so it qualifies as what is called nanometers, which is the smallest compound we can look at and measure. We can't look at it unless you have an electron microscope, but you can measure it. And exposure to this is by ingestion, inhalation, and through the skin. Think about it. Our skin is the largest organ of the body. You have thousands upon thousands, no, millions upon millions of pores, right? And this stuff can get in because it's so small, and it gets into the deepest part of your lungs. It can go all the way down anywhere at once. And then you're sitting there and you have a cup of whatever it is, say you're having a cup of coffee in the morning, mold spores and their mycotoxins are going to land on that cup of coffee, and you're going to drink this. So you're going to ingest it. or you're having a sandwich, it's going to get on that sandwich. It's every time you walk in or walk out, you're going to stir them up. Do you understand that part? Yes, no? Okay, if I don't see your heads moving, I get worried and angry. Next. Okay. These molds, the reason they're dangerous is because indoor dust has 1,000 times or greater whatever the spore count is that the industrial hygienist counted. So when he said, I found 800, nah, that's what his measuring ability was, 800. It's not 800, it's 800 times 1,000. That's almost 1,000,000. Now do you get, and this is all, by the way, this entire lecture is evidence-based. At the end of my lecture, there's 9 pages of references from medical textbooks as well as medical journals. Why? Because it has to be evidence-based. It can't be somebody's opinion. Okay? Next. How, I know this is a bit technical, the language that you're reading, but how does it get into you and affect your brain, for instance? Well, one is, for the lungs, it attaches to something called surfactant. It's a substance every lung has. Certain babies are born without surfactant, and they have to be put on a respirator right after birth until they can start developing that. You kind of understand? So it's very important. The other thing, this surfactant moves around throughout your lungs and carries it around. They cause the generation of reactive ROS, reactive oxygen species. These are highly inflammatory products. And they release cytokines. Cytokines is how your immune system responds to an attack. It is, imagine a whole bunch of Marines all of a sudden seeing something bad, they're going to react. And that's what the immune system sends in. And they react by causing inflammation. Think of a splinter in your finger. What happens? What are the cardinal signs of inflammation? Redness, swelling, pain, right? What's the fourth? You can't use your finger. Okay, so if it's a knee or an ankle or a finger or an elbow, it doesn't matter. You have those four signs of inflammation. Well, guess what? That's the cytokines from the immune system coming in to kill whatever it is, except they can't kill it. Okay? It causes injury to DNA. You know, DNA is that spiral, okay, that is in life. When you mess with DNA, such as when you get too much radiation, it causes cancer. That's what happens when DNA is damaged. Next slide. Okay. The other is, how does it get in the brain? Goes to your nose. The first major nerve of the brain is your olfactory nerve. It comes right here, okay? Because that's how you smell. And smell for us is always very important because it can tell us about danger. Think of fire. You smell, you can't see fire, you first smell it. A lot of things, the first thing is smell. So it goes up into that, through your nose, into the nasal mucosa, and then transported by this nerve to a certain area of the brain called the cribriform plate. I'm not going to get too technical here, and enters the pituitary axis. Pituitary is a gland right in the center of your brain where these two lines meet, and start doing their thing. Next slide. Okay, so what are the symptoms? Short-term memory loss, People walk around with the little sticky yellow notes because they can't remember from 1 minute to the next. ASD, autism. I had this, mom and dad brought me their son Tommy, who they said had been diagnosed with autism. Dad still is and was a pediatric orthopedist in a large city somewhere else. And what happened was he married his wife, and she had an MBA, and then they moved to this city, and he started practicing, and she'd come and help him on the business end of things. And when could they do this? They could only really do this during the late afternoons or on the weekends. And then they had Tommy, and they brought Tommy in with them when they worked and put him in a crib right against this certain wall, because she could see them and he could see them. He'd be working on charts, she'd be working on the bills and whatnot, okay? And after he got bigger, they put him in, what's that called, like a cage? Playpen. It's a cage, but they call it a playpen. They put him in a playpen, etc. And then he started acting funny and whatnot, and mom and dad got worried. And then one day on a Saturday, there's a knock on the door, and they're saying, who in the world would want to come in on a Saturday, knock on our door? There were two men dressed in Tyvek suits with respirator hooked on to a breathing apparatus, and they said, can we come in to check your office for mold? He said, what are you talking about? He says, 3 floors above you, this wall here has a sink, and that sink has been leaking behind the wall. And it leaked to the floor below that, which is the office of an oncologist, and he noticed his drugs weren't working anymore. People were dying from their cancer much more than before, and you're the next office. So he figured out it must be the mold that caused Spencer. So Tommy. He took Tommy to the pediatrician, to the neurologist. They're all in this big medical center building. Oh yeah, he's autistic. Finally, they flew over to see me. And sure enough, he was walking around the room in a circle. Just kept walking. In my medical center, we did not have the small cubicle examining rooms, because when patients would come see us, they were really sick. And why? Because they had already gone to 5, 10, 15, 20 doctors, had tests over and over. Why do an MRI 3 times in 3 months? Anyway, and the doctors kept saying, oh, this is idiopathic. Idiopathic in medicine means we don't know what caused it. What it really means is the idiot didn't know the pathology. Okay, he didn't. You go with a kid to a doctor, 2 minutes, and they give an antibiotic and a steroid. Boom, you're done. Do they ever look at what causes the problem? Do they sit down and ask? Do you know that I wrote an article on this and published it? Do you know the average time by American physicians, the average time spent with a patient is 7 to 11 minutes. And I'll never forget that, because remember 7-Eleven stores? 7 to 11 minutes. Now you're supposed to get a full history, a past medical history, an occupational history, do a complete examination in 7 to 11 minutes. That's impossible. That does not work. So they listen to the symptom and they give you a pill. My colleagues in Europe, I lecture in 2 universities in Europe, Oxford in England and the Sorbonne in Paris, the University of Paris. They're both about 900 years old. And they tell me, my colleagues say, you American doctors, all you do is every symptom, here's another pill. You have headaches, here's a pill. You can't sleep at night, here's another pill. Oh, you have aches and pains, take this. They don't try to find out why. Why? Because then you'd have to sit down and it would take quite a bit of time. And they don't have time because insurance cuts how much they get. So it's it's a whole mess. Our healthcare system is 38th in the world. Do you know who's 37th? Cuba. Do you know who's 36th? Serbia. Can you imagine? And we're the richest country, and we've screwed it up. Anyway, so chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. Remember that word, because at the end of this lecture there's a 2-page quiz. This is a disease, a disorder that mimics MS. Okay? And I've treated about 15,000 patients with issues from molds and mycotoxins, and neurologic problems are probably about 70% of what patients have. The other 30 is respiratory and some other things. So what happens with CIDP? They get diagnosed by MS by a neurologist. And MS is a death sentence. And they're given these medications that make them feel even worse, these drugs. And so the patient is desperate. I've had mothers come see me in their early 30s, having been given a diagnosis of MS. And they have little kids and they're crying because they've looked it up and found out that in a few more years they're going to be in a wheelchair, and then they're going to need a hospital bed, and they're not going to be able to walk around and take their kids to school, see them graduate from this grade or that grade or whatever. And then you do the correct diagnosis, and it's CIDP, and CIDP is treatable, and then you get rid of it. And then it's fun to watch how they go back to the neurologist and in the waiting room insult the receptionist, the nurse, and if the doctor happens to walk out, look out, because they literally gave a death sentence to that person, early death sentence. It cuts you right at MS cuts you right at the beginning of life. Anyway. Then you have this stuff. Okay? I'm standing. That's how they stand. Okay? Facial pain. They go see the ear, nose, and throat, who naturally does his x-ray thing, can't find anything, gives them something for pain. And then that whole process starts. Then they end up flying to see me. Glossopharyngeal neuralgia. That's a medical term meaning how you swallow. It hurts when you swallow. Head and neck pain. Okay? Headaches. Everybody's in this room has had headaches. But these headaches are of an unusual nature and severity. They're different. They're not what you've had before. And you can't get rid of them. Movement disorders. Movement disorders are jerks, Parkinson's, etc. Lastly, you can't see well, and you're wondering, and you go get glasses, and 4 months later you need another set, a different set. You know why? Okay, next slide. Well, remember, if you want to get rid of these are toxins. They are not living. They're not a bacteria, a virus, a mold. They are toxins. And it takes 500 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes to kill these guys. So 900 degrees for 10 minutes if you want to try to destroy this one, which is one of the more toxic ones, trichothecene. HEPA filters don't work. Only the activated carbon filters help. And those are expensive. Then, next slide, please. I brought this up, so I'm going to point something to you out in this. Spores of toxigenic fungi contain mycotoxins. Mycotoxins associated with spores go to respiratory and to other sites. Look at when these were written. So is this a new problem? How come doctors don't know about it? This has been written in books, in medical literature, in journals. It's available on PubMed. Do you all know what PubMed is? Okay? All you got to do is type it in and you have it. They can do that. Next. Trichothecene. Remember, I just mentioned that. Potent toxicity. Targets include the brain, immune system, heart, lungs, intestine, liver, kidneys, and skin. Look at the date. 1983. I didn't have a single gray hair. And I was good looking back then. Next one. Okay. Over 500, you remember the VOCs? Really, when you walk into a place and it smells moldy, what you're smelling are the volatile organic compounds. You're not smelling mold. Molds don't smell. What smells is the VOCs they produce. Okay? So, dominant VOC of mold is ethanol, which in itself is bad. Okay. This is the most common mold in homes is Aspergillus, and produces this mycotoxin, and it's carcinogenic. And this, the most hazardous, is aflatoxin, carcinogenic, 1988, 1969. I was in college, maybe, I can't remember. It's too long ago. It was in the previous century. Okay, next. Okay, what do they cause? All these things: cancer of the kidneys, esophagus, liver. And with a 10-year latency period, you can be affected by a mycotoxin today, and up to 10 years from now, die from liver cancer. It also causes testicular cancer, but only in men. Many others. Okay, next. Remember this, I told you that you can't make protein, and it inhibits RNA and DNA, which means our cells stop working. We replace cells every second of every day. Some cells die and they're replaced. Constantly we renew. The older you get, the less quickly they renew. Okay? DNA and protein adducts are what cause cancers. Oxidative stress and mitochondrial apoptosis. Apoptosis in medicine means cell death. The cells die. I don't want any of my brain cells to die. I don't want my heart muscle cells to die. I don't want my kidney cells to die. I don't want anything of those things to die. But that's what happens. Next. Okay. This is a study that was done at the Environmental Health Center in Dallas, Texas, and it was led by Dr. William Ray, a good friend for many, many years, and he died last August at age 82. He was working until the day he died. 65 subjects with mycotoxin, mold and mycotoxin, a lot of neurobehavioral. They acted strange. They weren't themselves. They had bad balance, and they couldn't tell the colors as well as before. Red, blue, green, yellow, white, black, etc. And neurological problems, they had a SPECT scan. You know what a SPECT scan is? It's called a single photon emission computerized tomography. What it is, it's a scan of your brain that looks at your brain in 3D color. Okay? So it's not a flat thing. You actually see structure, and it tells you which parts are underworking and which parts are overworking. A good friend of mine, Dr. Daniel Amen, has centers throughout the United States. He is the one who first really put into movement SPECT scans. And the way you may know of him is because he did SPECT scans of the NFL players who by age 45 were gone. Brain was gone. And he published that finding, and that caused this big stir. And, well, you've all known about it. It happened a few years ago. It was started by Dr. Daniel Amen. And Dan Amen has 120,000 SPECT scans he can look at from just about every disease process you can think of. So whenever you see Dan Amen, you know, like Amen, like Amen, okay? And you see a YouTube or he's on PBS, watch him. He's a great guy. We met when he still had a mustache and no gray hair. He now has only white hair. What's left, anyway. Okay, next slide. High levels of anti-nuclear antibodies. That is the first blood test a doctor will do, any doctor will do if he suspects you have an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, MS, scleroderma, etc., systemic lupus, so on and so forth. Then, CNS and PNS, that stands for central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. We're being attacked by your own body. Your own body starts to destroy because it can't figure out if that's an enemy or not, and it prefers to destroy and then see what happens. So that's what happens. MS is that typical of that disease, okay? Water damaged buildings leads to multiple health involving the central nervous system. Where's the central nervous system? It's inside your skull, it's your brain. We call it the CNS, central nervous system. Peripheral is everything else, from your toes and fingertips, you know, your spine, everything, okay? In addition to pulmonary and allergies, okay? So they initiate the inflammatory process. Next slide. What else? This is another study. Was conducted by this dubious guy of poor reputation in Houston, Texas, called Campbell. Anyway, this was 119 patients. Now here was what was great. These 119 patients worked for a government agency in the same place. It was an abandoned mall, okay? So the government got it cheap, and they moved these papers. What happened is every weekend they had to cover with plastic sheets their computers and printers and desks, because if it rained over the weekend, it'd all be wet. So we knew they all had the same, they were exposed at the same time, the same molds, in the same place, which is a great for us doctors to look at something like that. It's very interesting. So we did nerve conduction studies. When you go see a neurologist and he wants to check your nerves, he does what is called an EMG, electromyography. He puts a needle here in this muscle and a needle here in the same muscle in the nerve. And it's painful. And then he measures how long it takes to get from A to B. Now here's the clicker on this. Here's the bad point is that EMG equipment only works if you have lost 20% of that nerve protective coating. So by losing, if you have 18% loss, it's not going to pick it up. So but neurologists do that test for two reasons. Because only a neurologist is certified to do that, and since it's an invasive procedure, the insurance companies reimburse them handsomely. Okay? We did NCVs, nerve conduction velocities, because they're cheap, they take 10 minutes, and it can be done by a technician. So they're much easier on the pocketbook. And the equipment picks up starting at 5% myelin sheath loss of the nerve sheath, okay? So that's a much better proposal. The other part is that there's three kinds of nerves. You have nerves that feel, okay? Heat, touch, pin, etc. And then you have nerves that tell your muscles to do something, move your arm, move your leg, etc. Those are motor nerves, and the touch, feel are sensory. And there's a few nerves that are both. Well, it affected all of them. All of them. And remember, I talked to you about chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. This is how we diagnosed it. And all those people who thought had MS had CIDP, not MS. Next slide. Okay. Tremorgenic mycotoxins. I told you the story about the radiologist, okay? They cause tremors. They cause the release of neurotransmitters. Let me give you two neurotransmitters you know of. Adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, same thing. Okay? These are the things that make our brain tell other things to do whatever the brain decides it needs to be done. Okay? And this is, if some of you may remember this, if you really pay attention to the news, and some may not. But there were these plants that opened up in the Mexico side of the border in Texas, and they were making parts for auto people, you know, like parts for Delco radios and parts for the light in a car and the switches for the cars, etc. They were putting them together there, then shipping them north. So they were filled with all these women, and these women gave birth to babies without brains. So they look like frogs, literally. It's just a face. And there's nothing behind the face. It's not a head like this. It's like this. And they said, oh, it must be something in the components. Turns out it was the corn tortillas. Because remember, molds and mycotoxins grow on crops. And there was a bad crop, and this is what caused it. Next slide. Okay. Who knows what the microbiome is? Anybody? Okay, a few of you know. It's all the bacteria in your gut. Okay? We're made up from head to toe of a total of about 30 trillion cells. Well, that's all our cells. That's 30 with 12 zeros. Okay? She can tell you about numbers. The other part is the microbiome, microbes in your gut number 130 million, a trillion. So guess who wins? Okay? And I talked a minute ago about neurotransmitters. What happens is you have you have proteins. Remember I mentioned proteins to you? They're the building blocks for the body. Okay, they're made up of amino acids. So if the home is a protein, the bricks are amino acids. Okay? You got that picture? Now, there's an amino acid called tryptophan that you don't make. You have to get it from food. You get it from beef, you get it from chocolate, you get it from egg whites, etc. Okay? Tryptophan mixed in the gut with the bacteria produces what is called serotonin. Serotonin is your happiness neurotransmitter. When you're depressed, they give you Prozac, Wellbutrin, etc., etc. Those produce serotonin. Those have serotonin. That's to replace what you're not making. And serotonin helps make, through the gut, melatonin. Melatonin helps you sleep. And what happens with people when they're depressed? They don't sleep well. You get that? So this is what your gut is doing. And what happens is your gut When it's normal, these bacteria help you get rid of mycotoxins. Now, if you're going to go out there and drink Coca-Cola and salty snacks and fast food and pizza, it's going to affect the microbes in your gut in a negative way. So then you're not going to be able to have a good reaction to mycotoxins, and they're going to take over. Okay, they're negative and they don't benefit. They help the bad bacteria become more abundant while killing off the good bacteria that we need. And this interaction between these mycotoxins and your gut bacteria have a significant role in making you sick. People think it's only the lung. No. It's only the brain. No. It starts here in the gut. Next slide. So, okay, dysbiosis is the word when there's an imbalance in the gut of these microbes. Okay? It was coined by Dr. Ilya Mechnikov in 1908, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Why? He went to a country called Bulgaria to see why people there were living really till a very, very old age and under very terrible, harsh conditions. And he found out that they had one thing in common. They ate spoiled milk, which we call yogurt. Okay? And today in Spanish, yogurt is still Bulgarian milk. You don't say yogurt because they won't know what you're talking about. Say Bulgarian milk. Oh, okay, over here. So, what happens is you get asthma, autism, colon cancer, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, all this, diabetes, all these chronic disorders come at you because of this imbalance, because it causes inflammation in the gut. Okay? This is technical, but in turn, the severity of the disease keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so it depends on a great deal on what you eat and what you drink. Don't drink sodas. Okay, next slide. This inflammation makes the intestinal wall become permeable. So things such as partially digested foods and bacteria get through the intestinal wall. They go in the blood and they reach other organs, including the brain. And in the brain, we have what is called the blood-brain barrier. It breaches the blood-brain barrier. So now you're dealing with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc., etc., etc. You kind of follow this? Anyway, next, because this is too technical. All right, T2 toxins. Let's talk about mycotoxins. T2 toxin. By the way, we have it in this country. There was a really bad outbreak in China not too long ago. 65% of the patients, it looked like food poisoning. Okay? All these symptoms. Okay? And they've not only in China, India, but also the US. So it happens here. So if somebody tells you I had food poisoning, T2 toxin. So inflammation is what causes all these diseases. It starts with inflammation. That's the message I'm trying to tell you. Remember how mycotoxins cause inflammation. Well, this is what happens with inflammation. And what are they? They're carcinogenic, mutagenic, teratogenic, estrogenic, hemorrhagic, immunotoxic, hepatotoxic, etc. Next. United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization says that 25% of the world's crops, nuts, cereal, rice, are contaminated by mold. Next. Then you have low levels of mycotoxins in most things that we eat. Now here's the thing. If you're sick, it's going to affect you. If you're healthy, it's not, because you have an immune system. And your immune system takes care of bacteria, viruses, toxins every day, all day long, and you never even know it. You only know it if you start getting into bad shape. What's bad shape? You never exercise. What's bad shape? You drink a lot of sodas and you eat the wrong kinds of food. Okay? Mycotoxins can be found in the urine. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there's 2 labs in the United States, real-time labs and Great Plains Laboratory, that advertise a mycotoxin urine test. And it's measured in parts per billion. Wow. I'm sorry. It's not real, because you get it from the stuff you eat. I mean, beer, coffee, grape juice. You think these people drinking beer out here are sick? Oh, they're going to drink beer. And their bodies, if it has mycotoxins, your body takes care of it. Ochratoxin. It's a major target of ochratoxin are these. But here's the bad part about mycotoxins, about ochratoxin in particular, is that it crosses the placenta. So if a mother is pregnant, that fetus is going to get it. And then when the baby is born, it's in breast milk. And that's where the highest concentration of ochratoxin is found. Not urine, breast milk. Next. So, tell this sentence to a doctor and he won't understand it. That's because he's too busy and doesn't really read. Doesn't have the time to read. It's not his fault. Okay? Decrease in protein synthesis. Ochratoxin does all these things. So, the plasma half-life, how long it stays in your blood, is to go from, say, 100 down to 50 is 36 days. Then from 50 to 25, 36 days. Then from 25 to 12 and a half, another 36. You get how long it stays in the blood and circulates and affects all those organs you saw on the previous slide. That's what ochratoxin does. Okay? Next slide.
So, I just have a question.
You can't ask a question here. You can ask at the end. Next. It depletes zinc. Zinc is the #1 substance needed by your immune system. Everybody here should be taking 20 to 50 milligrams of zinc every day. Only don't buy it from Walmart or something like that, because they get a lot of their stuff from China. And I don't trust anything that they bring in from China. I'm sorry, it's not against anything, it's not against Chinese people. But there's been too many things. Have you read about the vaccines they produced for their own people? Anyway. Apoptosis, cell death, inflammatory mediators, cell cycle arrest in kidney and lung. So it stops the cell from functioning and then it dies. Ochratoxin. This simple supplement, get it from a friend of mine's website. His name is Dr. Steven Sinatra. He's a cardiologist in Connecticut. A real good guy. He's written a bunch of books. And Steve Sinatra. Okay? He's actually from that family. Okay? And that's where I get my supplement from for this. Because it'll counter all of that. Imagine. So, next. Okay. It's absorbed from the stomach and the next part right after the stomach. That's where when you eat something with whatever it is, grape juice or peanuts or corn or rice, etc. Okay? It changes your gut barrier. It gets out of the gut. It starts going in other places. Albumin is your #1 circulating protein in your plasma, in your blood. and it binds this ochratoxin right away. Just latches on and locks it into place. And you can't pee it out. It won't go because you'd have to lose protein. And the first thing a doctor looks at in your urine, is there any protein in it? Because that's the first sign of kidney failure. So, takes it out, 99.8%. And the reason I'm telling you that is because those two labs give you test results for ochratoxin in your urine. Don't believe that. I'm giving you the evidence. It's in this article and many others that I have at the end, but in particular this one. Next slide, please. So here are trichothecenes. Remember I mentioned these were the real bad guys? Okay, extremely toxic, very hard to get rid of. And these are the big ones: satratoxin, verrucorin, T2 toxin, and vomitoxin. Guess what vomitoxin makes you do? Okay, next slide. These were all used as biological agents. We used it in Vietnam. It was called yellow rain. This is not Agent Orange. Agent Orange is the defoliant, gets rid of leaves and things. This was yellow rain, and it devastated the enemy troops. The other thing, it was used against Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had a war before we went over there with the Iranians, and he used it against them. And in the National Guard review, if anybody is in the National Guard, there's a section that tells you how to protect your troops from this. Next, please. How do you solve a medical problem caused by toxins? 3 real easy words, okay? First, you detect. Second, you remove. And then you repair. Does it make sense? Okay. This is common sense. This is what every doctor should be doing when he encounters somebody with a toxin, whether it's from mycotoxin or any other kind of toxin. Second, so next slide, please. Here are the symptoms. And this is what confuses doctors, because this could be a whole bunch of diseases. One of them is Lyme. And Lyme is not that uncommon. I've been invited several times by the Global Lyme Alliance, based in Connecticut, to come and discuss with them how do you differentiate the two. I saw a patient. She was a 21-year-old girl. Her father was the head of an oil company, and I know you've bought gasoline at that company's gas station, but it's a world oil company. And he brought his daughter to me because she went to a girl prep school in New England, and one summer she went to summer camp for 3 weeks. And at the summer camp, they bunked together and it was moldy. And so she graduated and started at one of the top women's colleges in Massachusetts. Okay? And she couldn't make it. She was a brilliant student. She had incredible grades, but she couldn't make it. She'd come home from class and go to bed. She couldn't remember. She had joint aches and pains. She had short of breath. She became anxious and had depression. She had abdominal pains, lost hair, had nosebleeds. They thought it's Lyme. They took her to the top Lyme guy in New York City, Manhattan. And what did he do? He put her on antibiotics. Antibiotics, by the way, destroy the microbiome in the gut. So, destroyed the microbiome and nothing was helping her. So he said, okay, this must be a very bad kind of Lyme, so I'm going to give you intravenous antibiotics. And he did that for 1.5 years. Okay? Finally, after 3 years, they brought her to me. I did a mycotoxin blood test, not the pee-pee test. The blood test She lit up like a Christmas tree. 3 months later, she was back in school, in college. What does that tell you? Detect, remove, repair. There's one other issue with Lyme, is that in blood tests, it's very similar to mycotoxins. So these labs that say they check Lyme, they're checking for Lyme, but it could be mycotoxins as well. So there's a cross-reactivity, which means you have false positives and false negatives. Some people are told, no, you don't have Lyme, but they actually do, and some people are told, yes, you have Lyme, but they actually have mycotoxins. You understand that part of the lab test? It's the method of the lab that makes the difference. And right now there's only one mycotoxin lab in the States, in this hemisphere, from Alaska, Canada on down to South American pole. I bought flyers for it. Anyway, so next slide. That list confuses doctors because they say, well, it could be, my gosh, headaches. Well, that could be a brain tumor. Let's do an MRI. Oh, shortness of breath. Wow, that could be asthma. That could be this. Let's do some chest X-rays and CAT scans of the lungs, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're chasing rabbits. They can't find the real cause because they don't think of it. Lyme, you have to do a multipeptide ELISA test rather than Western blot. I know this is technical. This is the actual process. There is one lab in the United States that does a Lyme test the right way, and that is in Los Angeles, California. It's called Immunosciences Laboratory. Anyway, they do all these things. So you have to have the right tools to diagnose. You can't just go by symptoms. You have to have the definitive diagnosis from blood tests. Okay, next slide. All right. This lab does 12 mycotoxin tests, the 12 big ones. And they do an IgG antibody and an IgE. An antibody is what is formed when an attack happens. It's the army. This is the tanks, the artillery, all the soldiers and the sergeants and majors and colonels and everything else. They're all going in there, okay? They're IgG, attacking. IgE is all your allergies, okay? So you need to know, am I having an allergic reaction or IgG, a toxic reaction? Because IgG only lights up if it's been there for a while, okay? So these are the 12. You recognize this one, et cetera, okay? So this is what helps doctors decide, oh, it's positive, okay? Next. Also, your doctors need to do a serum immunoglobulin test. It's a simple test. It's been around for 30 years. It costs $30. It's not a big fancy test. Any lab can do it. These are only if you're having real issues like autoimmune diseases, etc. Your doctor has to choose which one of these would be most helpful. I know which ones I choose in my patients. These doctors, however, are not trained. They need to be trained. Next year, I'm going to start a training program for them, but most doctors have no clue. No clue. Next. Pulmonary function test, that's where you blow into that machine. It tells you how well your lungs are clearing oxygen. Your SPECT scan, we talked about the brain before, doing a SPECT scan. It gives more information than an MRI. Let me explain to you something. If I do an MRI today on a person, and that person tomorrow dies, and 3 days down the road I do another MRI of that dead person's brain, there's no difference. It looks at structure. It doesn't look at function, only structure. So is an MRI helpful? It's helpful to determine if there's something like a tumor or something growing, but it's not helpful for anything else. Next. So here's what I talked about before. That was the nerve conduction velocity, but this is very important. Brainstem auditory evoked response. This is a test of your acoustic nerve. It takes 10 minutes to do by a technician, and it gives you all the auditory pathways to the brain, etc. So you want this test because it's simple. We published a study back 15 years ago or so, and it was picked up by the National Academies of Science because we picked up acoustic neuromas, tumors of the nerve in adolescents from mycotoxins through this simple 10-minute thing. And they were shocked that I didn't need all these expensive things. Next. Visual evoked potential. That's looks at your optic nerve, the nerve in your eyes. Easy to do, another 10 minutes. You do all these 3 tests in 30, 45 minutes. Okay? It tells you all the pathways from the retina, the back of the eyeball, to the brain. Well, that's good information to have. It tells you all about these things. And it's much better than an MRI, even if you do a Tesla 3 MRI, which is the most powerful magnet that you can have today in an MRI. It only shows more finer structure, but it doesn't tell you what's working or not working. Okay, treatment. This is very important. The first rule to apply in toxicology is get the patient away from the toxin or the toxin away from the patient. You can't stay in a moldy, mycotoxic place and get treatment because you're not going to get better. Does that make sense? Replace mycotoxin with radiation. If you're being exposed to radiation, are you going to get any better with treatment if you go back there every day? No. Okay, so that's the big rule. Second, you have to, remember I told you proteins are destroyed, your immune system is destroyed, etc. You've got to rebuild that and at the same time kill the mold and mycotoxin. You can't do one and then the other. Either way, you have to do both simultaneously. That's what your doctor needs to do. Next, please. Okay, I want to tell you about this because this is a different treatment. Dr. Ponikow, when he was chairman at the Mayo Clinic of the ENT section, he did a study on 210 patients back in '99. Why? Because people were coming in, I have the crud. Oh, I have the crud again. Oh, I have the crud again. Oh, I have the crud again. So he says, what is this? We can't call it chronic sinusitis. We've got to find out what it is. And so he went in, he took them to the operating room, went up into their sinuses, grabbed some tissue, and grew out. 96 had mold grow out, 96% of those 210 with chronic sinusitis. So he actually appealed to the American Society of Ear, Nose, and Throat Doctors to change it to fungal rhinosinusitis, okay? But they didn't accept. Because in '99 they said mold? Nah, it just causes some allergies and athlete's foot. Doesn't do anything else. They didn't read all those studies published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, did they? Anyway, next please. Oh, the good thing is all you need is some amphotericin B nasal spray. Simple product. It costs very little. It doesn't irritate. It doesn't have side effects. Nothing. And you just use it 3-4 times a day. And after about 10 days to 2 weeks, it's gone. You've taken care of the problem. And you don't have to keep going back and getting antibiotics and steroids and I don't know what the heck else.
What was it called?
Does that make sense?
What was it called?
Amphotericin. Go back one slide, please. Okay. Okay, now, you also need this. This is immune system repair. You need an antifungal. What antifungal do you need? You need to take an antifungal known as Sporanox, generically called itraconazole. Just like there's narrow spectrum and broad spectrum antibiotics, there's narrow spectrum and broad spectrum antifungal medication. And Sporanox, you take twice a day with food, and it kills the source of the mycotoxin in your body. S-P-O-R-A-N-O-X, Sporanox. Okay? You need melatonin because actually it's a neurotransmitter that gets affected by mycotoxins. And you need these vitamins. Vitamin D3, you need a minimum of 5,000 international units a day. That's a pretty good dose. You don't need to go higher. Vitamin C, it's funny, I go to stores and I see vitamin C 250 milligrams, 100 milligrams. Who was the world's expert on vitamin C? Does anybody remember? His name, correct, Linus Pauling. And Linus Pauling is the only guy who's won the Nobel Prize twice. So he's pretty smart. And he wrote all about this. Why? Because back then there was a lot of polio, and he showed how vitamin C can kill viruses and get rid of polio. He also showed how vitamin C can get rid of hepatitis B. Today we don't give vitamin C, and people die from hepatitis B. But take vitamin C. Now, how much do you really need a day? If you get a virus, it's flu season's coming up. You get a virus, you take, depending on your size, 3 to 4 grams, 3 to 4,000 milligrams in the morning, and you repeat that dose in the evening. Okay? I can tell you that I've done it many times, and I know other doctors that do that. It takes care of 4 days. And there's no more virus. It's great stuff. I carry it around with me when I travel. Okay, and if you have CIDP, remember I told you about that chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, the best treatment is intravenous gamma globulin. I wrote a book on CIDP, I think, 15, 16 years ago. And I got a lot of calls from people all over the world asking me, because there's 8 products of intravenous gamma globulin, and there's only one that I recommend. So anyway, that's that. Next slide. Okay. What about adsorbents? That's not a mistake in spelling. Adsorbents. There's a doctor in Maryland, his name is Richie Shoemaker, and he gives all his patients cholestyramine, which is Questran. The problem with Questran is it binds up everything, good and bad, nutrients, vitamins, anything produced in your gut, it's going to bind up. It was originally marketed in the late 70s because people who had their gallbladder removed, there wasn't anywhere for the body to store the juice, gall. So it would go directly into the intestinal tract and cause diarrhea because it's highly acidic. So they developed cholestyramine to help wipe out those bile salts and acids. And now they're using it because they think, oh, it'll bind mycotoxins and everything else as well. That's the bad part. Okay, it helps with this. The problem is, it's better to use sodium bicarb. You know what sodium bicarb, remember Alka-Seltzer? Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Sodium bicarbonate. You can buy it cheap. Okay, it's much better than expensive cholestyramine. Both can cause toxicity to the liver. It's much better to use this. Okay? These these are natural supplement products that do the same stuff. And they're much better for us. Let me explain to you something. People say, well, I eat a healthy diet. Why should I take supplements? Why do I need this? I get it from the food I eat. I eat organic and I do all these things, etc. The problem is the Department of Agriculture, the United States Department of Agriculture in 1998 announced in their annual report to Congress that in 1998 that 98% of all agricultural fields were devoid of nutrients. I don't know if you remember this, but I do. I remember when we used to be the breadbasket, wheat breadbasket, we sold billions of tons to the Russians. Well, you're supposed to let the land lie fallow for so long in between things. No. We didn't do that. So now you can't get the same level of nutrients from foods. And beef, or cattle, I should say, hogs, which is pigs, turkeys and chicken are grown in what are called CAFOs. You know what CAFOs are? Concentrated animal feed organizations. Thousands of cattle, thousands of hogs, thousands of all these things. The definition here is confined. They're not allowed to move. Okay? The chickens, everybody wants chicken breasts today on the menu. Okay? These chickens are fed hormones and their breasts get so big they can't walk, they can't stand. If you look at the weight of a chicken 40 years ago and the weight of a chicken today, 5 times more. Okay? The 2 chicken breasts are the size of the whole chicken. Okay, I have a whole lecture on that, so I'm not going to get into it here. So anyway, that's why we're not getting the nutrients from our foods. By the way, all commercial chicken feed contains arsenic. Did you know that? Why? Because it swells the stomach of the chicken up, and they eat more to fill that part up. Okay, now arsenic is a heavy metal, like lead or mercury, okay? And heavy metals all go to brain and bone. So when you're eating that chicken, think of it, the other part is, it goes to brain and bone. Arsenic is a white powder. When heated, it turns purple. Okay? You get to the bone of the chicken, and you say, oh, look, this purple part must be because of veins. Excuse me, have you ever cooked a steak and cut through it? Is there any purple? You don't think meat has veins? No, because when you cook it, it burns. But when you cook chicken, what happens to the bone? You get purple. Guess what that is? Not veins. You kind of getting it, what we're eating? And I can go on and on. Next slide. And these binders, cholestyramine, you can't give them to people who have diabetes or hypothyroidism or liver disease or anything like that. Any alcoholics here? No. Okay. Well, you can't take these binders if you're an alcoholic. All right. Next, please. And you can't take them if you're on any of these drugs. This is the most common blood pressure pill in the United States. Thyroid medication, penicillin, diabetic drugs, estrogen and progesterone. They all get wiped out. Next slide. Treatment. So glutathione, probiotic, and diet, high-fat diet. I talked about that in the beginning. You remember that? Remember, there's a 2-page quiz coming up. 80% of the immune system is in the gut. So you need a good probiotic, but I'm going to tell you something about probiotics. Yogurt. I wrote an article on this, so I researched it very carefully. In the United States, any dairy product has to be pasteurized. Okay? If you take milk out of a cow and start selling it, there's going to be men in blue jackets with yellow letters on the back, and they're going to do mean and nasty things to you. It has to be pasteurized. How do you make yogurt? You have to put bacterial cultures on them. So they take milk that they deliberately spoiled, and then they pasteurize it, and then they put more bacteria on it, and after a few days they pasteurize that, then they sell it. Think of it. It can't go out unpasteurized. Okay? And the two most common probiotics, either in yogurt or in capsules, are lactobacilli and bifidobacterium. I'm going to show you why they don't work. Okay? $30 billion a year. Yogurt. Chobani. Blah, blah. And you know what? You now can have vanilla yogurt, chocolate yogurt. Do you think they put real chocolate and real vanilla? No, those are chemical flavorings. They're artificial. Okay, and it's sweet. How do you think they made it sweet? How do you think when you stir it, it goes pink or brown or whatever? It's artificial coloring. Okay? So, next. Reading University in England, in London actually, did tests for the FSA. FSA is the FDA of the United Kingdom and of the European Union. And they checked all these probiotics that you can buy to see how they worked. Less than 10% made it through the stomach. Why? Because the stomach has acidity. That's what it's supposed to do. Think of children. They walk around on their hands, they put everything and anything in their mouth, and they don't get sick. Why? Because all that bacteria is destroyed in the stomach by gastric acids. Okay, so this stuff is no good. So people are buying this. Not only is it not good, I'm going to show you something else. Next. I go to conferences, and there'll be an exhibit room, and they'll have, oh, mine's better than yours. Mine's got 300 billion colony-forming units. Yours is only 20. Mine's better than yours. Mine's bigger than yours. I don't know. There's no scientific rationale. There is nothing in the medical literature that says this is better than that. Nothing. Okay? That shows 200 is better than 10. And most probiotic studies are done on a single strain in animals. And then the quality is more important, and DNA sequencing. So in probiotics, you only want to use the one that has had DNA sequencing, which means they can follow it through and measure it in your poop. Not that you may want to do that yourself. Next, please. So, at UC Davis, University of California at Davis, this is a 2-year-old study, it's 2016. They went into stores and bought 16 different probiotics. They took them back to the university and tested them. If it says they had these things on the label, they opened up the capsule and measured. The majority were dead bacteria therapy. They were dead. None matched what was on the label except for one. Only one. And then these are all lactobacilli and bifidobacterium, so they're going to die in your stomach anyway. Okay, next. So you need the one that are made with bacillus spores, because these actually work. They take care of, in children, of allergies. They increase your immune system. They decrease urinary tract infections. They reduce the side effects of anti-Helicobacter pylori antibiotic therapy. They get rid of SIBO, which is a big problem in some people. They get rid of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. There's two kinds. They get rid of the one that is diarrhea. And helps kids. And it reduces, so you get the influenza, instead of being sick for 10 days, you're sick for 3 or 4. So, and it helps in rheumatoid arthritis patients. It helps reduce the pain significantly. Several studies have shown that. These are all published information, and there's 9 pages after this is over where you can research it on PubMed, grab any one of them, put in the name, the author, or the name of the study, and you get the results, and you can read up on it. Next. Be careful when there is a flood, because this is when you get problems like what happened recently. They're not going to get sick this week. 3 months down the road, 4 months down the road, 6 months down the road, there's going to be huge problems from the hurricane. Texas is now a big issue. You remember that hurricane flooded Houston? Let me tell you, they're having huge issues. And the doctors aren't recognizing it. Next, please. This is my email. If you have a question, you can answer it there. And this is the lab that does the test. Now, I want to urge you, if you email me and say, I have this and this problem, what should I do? I'm not going to answer it. I cannot give medical advice without having a patient examined, and et cetera, et cetera. So by just guessing, I'm committing fraud, and I can get in trouble, and it's not helpful to you either, because I don't know your whole medical history. I've never examined you. I haven't seen all the tests you've had previously, et cetera. So don't ask me those kind of questions. But if you have other kind of questions, be more than happy to answer them. And if this lab is about to open November 1st, so if you want mycotoxin blood testing, this is where you get it. Don't waste your money paying $700 for a urine test. I showed you why it doesn't work. Okay? Why don't you go through the next slides like this? Next, 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 next. Those are the studies. So everything I've told you is actual evidence. It's not hocus pocus, and it's not my opinion. And if you go to PubMed and you put in my name, Campbell AW, there'll be about 90 publications or so come up. Many of them are in mold, so you can read those as well. Any questions?